Chapter 11. Puppetry. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. Inala currently had 3 advantages: toxin refinement, elixir condensation, and the knowledge honed in his previous life. Toxin refinement allowed him to cause a reaction within a toxin and receive products that were tonic in nature. It was best geared towards mud vipers. Elixir condensation causes the contents of the elixir to directly be stored in spirit containers, just like prana. From here, whenever the cultivation technique is practiced, the elixir's effects would circulate alongside prana. This suppresses the elixir's contents from being used to mend the body's damage to the absolute minimum, allowing absorption to be maximum. With the technique, he would have been able to gain 80 prana from that elixir. The effects of the 2 skills were spectacular. A cultivator can only use skills derived from their cultivation technique. Therefore, these 2 skills, derived from the mystic bone art, would help him irrespective of his cultivation stage. It paved the foundation to create his own skill set. He had been studying these 2 techniques for the past month. From the principles with which they functioned, how they varied with respect to various variables, the formulae they behaved upon, etc. There were plenty of principles that combined together to form a skill. He dissected them and first focused on the parts that took priority. He studied them zealously. At the end of it, he created a skill of his own: puppetry. Through mystic bone art's refinement technique, he refined a piece of bone into a miniature skeleton. It was a spirit weapon, or rather, a bunch of spirit weapons joined into a whole. In terms of battle power, it had none. Not only were the spirit weapons tiny individually, but they also required complex motions to move the puppet. The efficiency fell drastically. So, it moved slowly. Battle wasn't its intended purpose though. Using a portion of the elixir condensation skill, he created tiny compartments within each piece of bone forming the skeleton. Through a portion of toxin refinement skill, he stored the mud viper's toxin within. The function of the toxin was to soften the mud viper's hardened mud. He had refined the toxin to only include the softening property. Moreover, its degree of potency varied in every container. Following that, he mixed the toxin in the hardened mud and used toxin refinement on it at varying levels, finally obtaining the ratio to create clay. Being a shut-in for 6 years, to pass the time, Inala took on art as his hobby. Sculpting was his favorite. Therefore, building a body on the skeleton using clay took less than a day. Mystic bone art, puppetry. He infused his prana into the puppet and watched it come to life. The lips on its face slowly widened to form a smile. The emotion wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Facial expressions required the muscles to move. For that, he created the face using different compositions of clay. For the emotion of happiness, the respective compartment within the skull would release the toxin into the face, causing each clay to react in a certain way. They harden and soften at varying degrees, thereby contracting and expanding accordingly, creating the expression of happiness. This took him lots of trial and error to achieve. To avoid wasting materials in his limited prana, he stuck to miniatures. At present, all the puppet could display was the emotions of happiness and sadness. This was already the limit within the time constraints. But, he was happy with the result. On the flat rectangular board made from mud, he began to carve a realistic background. Dabbling in art for 6 years came in clutch. After practicing for 2 days, he was ready. Evening, the next day. Right as the day's classes ended, he hurried to his room and returned with a large suitcase. Inala began setting up a stall in the academy's open ground. After classes, the orphan students generally practiced there, for there wasn't enough open space anywhere else. Okay, none of them are here. He was looking out for the reincarnates. They would obviously be aware of what he was doing and might interrupt or sabotage his efforts. Thankfully, they were all busy preparing for the event that would happen the next day. It was why he picked such an evening to test out his card. Come one, come all. He shouted, mimicking the fish market vendors from his previous world. There wasn't any sense of professionalism involved here, but it did the job of getting one's attention. There wasn't any entertainment in their daily lives, so the students were curious about his hollering. Soon, about 10 people had gathered before him, one of which was an instructor who happened to pass by. "Please be seated, everyone. I'll entertain you with a fun little something." Saying so, Inala patted the cuboidal box on the stall he had set up. It spanned a meter in width, 40 centimeters in height, and 20 centimeters in thickness. The entrance was a thin wall of hardened mud, acting as a curtain. Embedded in its center was a tiny slab of bone, a spirit weapon. Inala moved it up with his prana, raising the curtain, revealing a mini theater. The background sported trees, a pair of hills, and a river. It was a classic picture that everyone drew at first. All Inala did was portray it realistically to give a sense of depth, like an optical illusion. There were some props strewn on the ground, mostly rocks. 2 puppets stood amidst them, one big, one small. The big one spanned a height of 30 centimeters, appearing like a giant in the scene. The small one spanned 10 centimeters. Both were humanoid in shape and appearance, but the design wasn't very human. It was a caricature at best. At his infusion of prana, the scene began to play out. One day, while walking, the big one became tired and decided to rest while leaning on the hill. But using it as a home was the small one that felt disturbed by the big one's presence. It came out, looking sad. But upon seeing the big one's feet, the small one became happy as it picked up a needle from nearby. It then slowly approached the big one's feet and poked it with the needle. The big one comically flew into the air and slammed into the ceiling. It then fell to the ground, resulting in a loud splash. The small one ran into its house using the chance. The big one got up and stared in confusion as its face was compressed like a spring from the impact. A few seconds later, it sagged, unable to recover. Haha. Its stupefied face elicited mild laughter from a couple of students. Inala noted down the response, "Okay, it's working. But there needs to be some changes to the delivery of the jokes." The big one and small one were straight-up plagiarized from the infamous cartoon, Tom Jerry. It was a trial and tested series, so he couldn't go wrong with it. Even without music, it was working to make the viewers laugh, not to the extent he hoped, but it worked. As long as he improves his craft, things will get better. Inala had prepared a script for 10 minutes in total. Once he was done, there were cheers from the students. That was refreshing. It had been years since I last laughed. The instructor got up, calmly nodded at Inala, and walked away, confusing the latter. What does that reaction mean? Chapter 12. Inala's comedy troupe. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The instructor was an elite. Cultivators at the body stage were referred to as an elite in their clan. Elites were in charge of the overall security of the herd. As a result, they worked tirelessly. The fact that he spent 10 minutes of his time watching a play was a statement enough. As he thought about it, Inala understood the instructor's nod at the end. He expressed that his time spent watching the play was worth it. That's a good sign. That was enough to boost his confidence as Inala packed up the stall and returned to his room. Staring at the mess he made on the floor, he groaned, "I'm never going to clean this. My bones healed only recently. They'll fracture if I bother scraping off all the hardened mud and clay." Knock. Knock. It was nighttime already. He knew who the visitor was. Followed by a sigh, he infused his prana into 2 spirit weapons. Immediately, the false mud doors he had installed in the room moved, covering most of the room. Inala opened the door and greeted Greha, "You're right on the dot as usual. Let's get this done with." Saying so, Greha dragged in 2 unconscious mud vipers. "Be careful. Don't damage them." I know, rolling his eyes at the words he had heard a dozen times by now, Inala gently inserted a spirit weapon into the mouth of the mud viper and activated his toxin refinement skill. He was careful to not harm it, gasping in exhaustion a couple of minutes later. He wiped his sweat and brought out the spirit weapon, causing it to pour out the refined mud viper tonic into a vial. 10 milliliters of the tonic had been created. Onto the second one, Greyha patted the second mud viper hurriedly. Let me take a breather. After 10 minutes, he used the toxin refinement skill to create another 10 milliliters of mud viper tonic. Observing the 20 milliliters of the tonic excitedly, Greyha commented nonchalantly, you know, even if you provide me 20 milliliters every day, we'll still be short of a liter after a year. Isn't our deal 8 liters? That's your issue, Inala snorted, if you want more, bring more mud vipers. Besides, I'm only doing this out of the fairness of my heart. We haven't notarized our deal or anything, so I'm not legally accountable. Don't expect me to create it out of thin air. And I definitely won't share the tonic I make from mine. I know, sheesh. Raising his hand, Greyha intended to leave. He then stared at the mud walls blocking most of the room, displaying an area the same as the rooms of the rest of the students in the dorm. He's hiding everything he's been up to. Well, if I gave it my all, I can defeat him and pry open his secrets. But I might sustain damage too. Damn, this disease. It'll push back my plans and make me spend more resources on recovery. The other bastards might overtake me using the chance. Don't even bother, Inala snorted upon observing Greyha's intentions, I'll beat you up if you try. Can you? Greyha laughed mockingly and unleashed his prana. T.27 prana. Inala was shocked. Greyha had been gaining 1 prana every 2 days. That was the fastest speed after the regressor. I'm double yours. Greyha spoke calmly, if we fight, I have enough means to defeat you. Well, the only reason I don't is because any injury I face might cause the prana I built up to collapse. It's not worth it. He slowly closed the door, but the day I get the cure. It needn't be said. There only existed one cure. The one that obtains it will soar in strength. To avoid any potential threat to their future rise, they'll purge the rest of the reincarnates, including the regressor. Even the regressor will be fighting for the same cure. So, the upcoming bloodbath was unavoidable. The door shut slowly, but it felt like a loud slam in his mind, causing Inala's mood to worsen. You think your plan is superior? Let's see about that. Snorting in response, he pushed aside the false mud doors and began to work on his mini theater. Based on the feedback he received from the audience, he worked on improving the experience. He also restocked the toxins within the bone containers and even carved out a large plaque to make his stall stand out more. Inala's comedy troupe. The name was simple and it showed what his stall was about. Just as he was working on the finishing touches, there was a knock on the door once again. Who the heck is visiting now? Greyha was his only visitor over the past month. So, he was curious. Once he sealed the room with the false mud doors, Inala opened the door, surprised to see the visitor, Virala. The acting coward had arrived, his expression smug. And wrapped around his arm like a koala was Rava. It seemed she had fallen hard for him. He's the playboy kind, huh? Inala thought and asked, why are you here? I came to trade. Saying so, he made way as Rava dragged a tub inside. At the familiar sight, Inala shook his head spontaneously, I refuse. There were 20 liters of mud viper toxin in the tub. It was obvious Virala was asking him to refine it. To refine 20 liters would use up all his prana and a bit more. He would have to take breaks to recover some prana. Since the toxin wasn't in a mud viper, at most a liter of mud viper tonic would be created. And, a liter of the tonic, when consumed, only netted in a growth of 10 prana. Moreover, if Inala wished to recover the expended prana through food, it would take him a few days. That meant his plans for the event tomorrow would be messed up. Virala arrived at the perfect time to mess things up for him. Give it to him, as Virala said. Rava extended a basket to Inala. This is. He stared at the berry-like fruit within, sporting a creamy white color. It was a paruta fruit, the only source of pure prana in Sumatra. There were hundreds in the basket. A group of paruta trees grew within the empyrean tusk stomach, producing paruta fruits. Consuming 100 paruta fruits raised a cultivator's prana by 1 unit, not just in terms of recovering expended prana, but also in its growth. The fastest way to cultivate is to consume paruta fruits. But they were a protected resource and only sparingly distributed, for they doubled down as a currency. With a year's shelf life, they were an expendable currency resource. 400 paruta, Virala said, watching Inala's eyes light up in desire. This is just the advance. If you refine the 20 liters before daybreak, you'll receive another 400. Whether or not you wish to take up the task is your choice. Virala smiled smugly, but, can you afford to pass this up? Chapter 13. The simp breaks free. You are listening at novelfull.audio. It was an offer impossible to refuse. Inala was indeed conflicted. The offered 800 paruta would grant him an increase in 8 prana. It didn't necessitate any training. The moment he consumes them and activates his cultivation technique, he'll gain 8 prana in a matter of minutes. 8 prana wasn't anything worth commenting about at present, as his goal was to first get used to the process of accumulating and losing prana. It was why his prana was only at 14 units. Every time he built the 15th unit, he would destroy it to get accustomed to the process of a spirit container shattering. Inala stared at Virala, gritting his teeth upon seeing the latter smile. His plan couldn't be any more obvious. He intended to sabotage Inala. At present, thanks to obtaining 2 skills from Risha, Inala was ahead of the rest of the reincarnates. Therefore, something had to be done to pull him down from the lead. When Sumatra Chronicles started, it began with a 1-year countdown. A year into the storyline, the first major disaster would occur. And in it, the 44th Empyrean Tusk would lose its life. Disasters and opportunities came in droves at that time. And those that failed to seize any opportunities would be dead. Inala's opportunity too lay there. If he were to miss it, everything he planned for the future would be for naught. Less than 30 people from the 44th Empyrean Tusk survived the first major disaster. Only by becoming an elite was survival a non-0 chance. His life and death would be up to fate if he remained in the spirit stage even then. It was in Inala's best interest to build up his prana right as the disaster starts. Until then, he only intended to raise his experience with the spirit containers to the absolute maximum. And the only way to build up prana realistically and safely in a short time frame was by consuming paruta fruits. 100 paruta fruits granted 1 unit increase in prana. Ideally, saving up more than 9,000 was necessary. It was in efforts towards that was he making Inala's comedy troupe. Virala's offer accounted for almost 1/10 of his objective. Passing it up was foolish, even if it was a trap. The trap was too alluring to resist. Virala too was aware of that, hence why he confidently stood at the entrance. Even if my play's a success tomorrow, I might not earn this much. Inala sighed, I'll take my chances when an opportunity presents itself. Only then will I survive in this world. Fine, I accept. Saying so, Inala received both the basket of paruta fruits and the tub of mud viper toxin. There was also a small container meant for the tonic to be stored. Before daybreak, you hear me. Virala slung his arm around Rava's shoulder and whistled away, if you don't, you won't be paid the remainder. Closing the door shut, Inala collapsed to the floor, slowly. He had made it a habit to avoid any forms of exertion, for that might fracture his bones. Man, I might be dead tired by the end of this. He might even miss the event. After pondering for a minute, Inala propped himself and took out his rugged sphere, and dipped it in the toxin tub. He had been using it to refine the mud viper toxin for the past month. And thanks to the effects of the mystic bone art, the rugged sphere was gradually changing. His refining efficiency with it was improving constantly. Inala took action and smirked a few minutes later. He would finish well before the deadline. The reason was simple. Virala miscalculated. When Risha first created the toxin refinement skill, its effects were very lacking. The results were minimal while the process took a lot of time. And by the time he gained proficiency on it, he was a powerhouse. So, the refining time stated in the novel wasn't reliable. The only other instance was when Risha used it during the fight. It was very fast. But, when Inala used it, he only managed to refine 2 milliliters. The time taken was too long for such an amount. Virala calculated based on it, determining an amount of toxin that slightly exceeded his skill gap so that he would fail the deadline and be underpaid for his efforts. Moreover, he would be too exhausted to attend the event that would happen immediately after. He might have also probed Inala's refining time from Greha. Thereby, he concluded that 20 liters might be the perfect amount. Not too much that Inala would refuse straight away and not too little that he could finish it easily within the given time and have energy to spare. If only Greha knew I was holding back a little all along while refining for him. He was always careful when interacting with the reincarnates. And that indeed saved him. At regular intervals, Inala refined the toxin. Before he took a break, he downed some mud viper tonic using the elixir condensation skill. And while resting, he focused on perfecting his play. This allowed him to expend less prana than usual while using the toxin refinement skill. After all, with the elixir condensation skill, the effects of the mud viper tonic had been enhanced to its limit, greatly suppressing his fragment disease. This meant he could exert himself better, less prana was used to protect his body, and he wouldn't become as tired as usual. As a result, 2 hours before daybreak, he was done with the task, grinning smugly, "Thank you for the treat, Virala." It was enough if he waited for Virala to return. But, why would he behave passively when a perfect chance came knocking at his doorstep? It officially gave him a reason to meet with the most important character during the initial phase of the story. Inala left the dorm and walked towards a luxurious house beyond the academy. Arriving before the door, he knocked on it, prostrating on the ground in respect. Once the door opened, "I greet Granny Oyo." "Are you done already?" said the lady within. She was called a granny but looked no different from a woman in her 20s. She was originally an old lady, tethering on the verge of death, unable to cultivate due to the fragment disease that plagued her. But once her research on the disease reached a turning point, she was able to suppress the disease to a great extent and cultivated like a maniac. She reached the body stage and gained the power of the intermediate silver-grade pranic beast, pitcher salamander. A pitcher salamander lived for 380 years. Once she gained that much lifespan, Granny Oyo turned young. She was currently 127 years old and had already entered the life stage, becoming a master that ruled over the clan's elites. She was the 44th Empyrean Tusk settlement strategic asset, thanks to being the sole person in the settlement that could refine an elixir. Granny Oyo had an idea of Virala's plans. She didn't know the reason but attributed it to some bad blood between the two. So, when Inala arrived 2 hours before the deadline, she was pleasantly surprised. "Yes, Granny Oyo," Inala responded promptly. His heart thumped as he dared not look at her. The reason wasn't just the necessity to display respect to a master, but another, bigger reason. His teenage hormones were going wild. Right before the first major disaster began, Sumatra Chronicles released the official art of the important characters until that point. Among them was Granny Oyo's appearance, receiving a lot of fanfare from the readers. Many people even simped for her, including Inala. He even made lewd fan art of her, sold it to perverted readers, and made a lot of money. He too used them for research purposes. He was one of the perverts too. And now, finally meeting such a person in the flesh, especially with the gentle backdrop created by the celestial worlds in the sky, the perverted simp suppressed and sealed deep within him was wrestling to break free. Then, where is it? Granny Oyo smiled, mildly irritated as she failed to see the tub nearby. The knock on the door woke her up. It wasn't even morning yet. So, her temper was short. That, I can't carry it due to my disease. Inala controlled himself desperately, mentally pummeling the simp in him. Bring it. Granny Oyo extended her index finger and flicked his forehead. A burst of wind enveloped Inala as he was sent flying hundreds of meters until he landed at the entrance to his room, coming to a stop after he crashed into the door. Surprisingly, none of his bones had broken from the impact, but that wasn't what he noticed first. Something is rising. He muttered with a reddened face, and it's not my prana. Damn, she awoke something in me. Chapter 14. Meeting Granny Oyo. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Living holed up at home was bad for the human mind. Not only would one's life experiences come to a standstill, but even the experiences accumulated before that phase would dull out until nothing was left of them. One's mind would become weak. Therefore, those that remained shut-in had weak minds, unable to endure any stress. They were prone to anger outbursts, wore their emotions on their sleeves, and worst of all, had no handle over their desires. After all, there would be no consequences to their actions. There was no lack of beautiful women in the world. As long as one roamed the streets, they would at least come across a few. And as long as a person lives in such a world, they would acclimate to that setting. Even if they saw a drop-dead gorgeous woman, all they would do was admire her mentally and let out one or two comments. They wouldn't lose all control over their motor senses like Inala did at present. After 6 years of being a shut-in, whenever he came across good-looking woman online, as long as he felt the most minor of urges, he would fap. Had he been in a working environment, he would have had to restrain himself, otherwise, he might lose his job. Besides, being labeled a pervert would be the end of their career. Therefore, as one keeps restraining their urges, they would soon reach a point where they would have great control over their urges and would be able to mask them while mingling about in society. Inala had lost that touch. And even after reincarnating, in the name of practice, he had holed up in a room. Habits die hard, after all. He stared at his pants, seeing the hill that had formed there. He hurriedly applied pressure onto it. This is no time to rise, boner.cohen. After entering his room, Inala activated the mystic bone art and meditated for 5 minutes, sighing in relief after seeing that he had calmed down. The perverted simp in him had been sealed in the abyss once again. Thereby, he was able to think logically as before, observing his body to sense a mysterious energy circulating in him. Is this what protected my bones from breaking during that impact? When Granny Oyo flicked him, she had infused this energy into his body. Its effects wouldn't last for long, as the infused amount was very little. But, it was calculated to be enough for him to make the trip to her house while carrying the tub of tonic. The tonic was only a liter, weighing a bit more than a kilogram. It wasn't heavy, but it had to be noted that he was on the topmost floor. It implied he had to carry that tub and walk down the stairs. If he stepped down hard, the generated shock might crack the bones in his arm that was carrying the extra weight. This was why he knocked on Granny Oyo's door without the tub. Moreover, he was probing her to see if she would use any tonic on him to help him perform the task easier. She's just as described in the novel, prone to unleashing killing intent, but innately kind. Inala got up, carried the tub of tonic, and rushed down the flight of stairs. He was excited, for he was able to run down like a normal person his age. The effects of his fragment disease had been vastly suppressed by the tonic infused in him. Granny Oyo was a walking, talking pharmacy. She stored tonics for a variety of purposes in her body and was able to infuse them in others when necessary. In battle, she was a healing unit, working alongside the masters that faced terrifying pranic beasts. In Sumatra Chronicles, after Risha saves Rava, he's taken under the tutelage of Granny Oyo. She helps suppress his fragment disease, allowing him to train. And with the assistance of the various tonics she provided him, Risha reached the peak of the spirit stage before the first major disaster started. Every reincarnate intended to get her assistance, but Virala was the one that ended up succeeding. Moreover, he made Rava fall hard in love with him, thereby raising his importance in Granny Oyo's eyes. Just to ensure a better future for her granddaughter, she helped Virala, providing greater assistance than she did to Risha. After all, Risha never had a romantic interest in Rava. It was only the latter's admiration towards him. But Virala changed that and entered a relationship with Rava, thereby garnering more attention from Granny Oyo. During their interaction, Virala hadn't unleashed his prana, so Inala was unable to determine how much prana the latter had amassed. It should be high. But, it doesn't matter. You're only Rava's lover. Until you marry her, the assistance you'll get from Granny Oyo is still limited. You won't obtain her core techniques. Inala had formulated a plan the moment Virala knocked on his door. He arrived before Granny Oyo's house, watching her be seated on a chair in the living room. The door was left ajar, and the moment he arrived, a cold voice echoed out, "Enter." "Please excuse me," Inala said respectfully as he entered the living room, all while staring at the ground. He dared not take a risk by staring at her face. Not only was she beautiful, but she also had an explosive body. Coupled with her mature woman's charm and her authoritative countenance, he would instantly become her simp if she leads him on even a little. The only way to prevent that was to avoid staring at her. One day, after he had shed the side effects of being a shut-in, he would be able to stare straight at her face. The moment he entered, the tub of tonic flew out of his hand and hovered before Granny Oyo. A droplet flew out and entered her mouth. After tasting the effects of the tonic, Granny Oyo asked without a hint of emotion, "Where did you learn this refinement skill?" "It's eerily similar to mine but has been improved." "How's this possible?" She stared at him, observing Inala's figure from top to bottom, frowning as she noticed how he continued to stare at the ground. "He's a mere student. He shouldn't have gone beyond our settlement until now. I'm the only one with tonic refinement knowledge in this settlement." "So, from whom did he learn?" "I asked you a question," she snorted and released a tinge of killing intent, saying after watching Inala's legs give in, "Look at me when I ask you something. Otherwise, I'll kill you." Chapter 15. Spirit Reinforcement Skill. You are listening at novelfull.audio. "I obtained it during the Mud Viper crisis," Inala expressed honesty as he lifted his head and stared at Granny Oyo's face. At the sight of her, his mind blanked, his face blushed a beet red. "How cute," Granny Oyo stared at him as if she were looking at an ingredient in the market. "Name a price." "Judging by his actions, he doesn't seem willing to reveal the source. But that's fine. It doesn't matter who he bought it from. It only matters that it lands in my hands." Granny Oyo disliked using force unless necessary. Besides, she was curious about the truth. The Mud Viper tonic was very familiar to her. It was similar to the ones she refined, just a tad more advanced and potent in effect. So, she intended to verify her conjecture after looking into the skill. That would change how she dealt with him. Since he was commanded to, Inala had no other choice but to stare at her face. As a result, he couldn't think of anything. How pretty. He was aware of his weakness and hence came prepared, using a line from the sentences he had ready by heart. "Please exchange it with a skill." "Are you negotiating with me?" Her mood worsened a little as the room turned hot. Inala was sweating buckets by now and plopped to the floor, gasping for air. He was breathless, strained to even budge an inch. That this is the strength of someone at the life stage. "I." He bit his tongue and used the pain to shout, his voice echoing weakly, almost a whisper under the pressure, "I want to train. My body is brittle, but I want to train. My spirit containers continue to shatter, but I want to strengthen them. I want to become strong. He inhaled in the end, like a drowning man chancing upon air. The pressure vanished. The room turned warm as even a cool breeze washed over him, alleviating the heat in his body. Take a seat, Granny Oyo snapped her finger, unleashing a burst of wind that forced Inala into a lotus position. By the time he managed to react, a bone slab appeared in his hand, and seated behind him was Granny Oyo, her hand on his back, positioned right above his heart. Take in a deep breath and circulate the mystic bone art, she said, her voice containing a mysterious commanding power, unleashed by a faint vapor she released. Moreover, she inserted a bit of prana in him, triggering his cultivation technique into activating on its own. This technique. Inala realized what she was attempting. This was the same that Risha intended to use on him for the elixir. Mystique bone art, prana domination. The foreign prana was absorbed by his cultivation technique as it circulated in his body, starting from his stomach. It was digested, broken down into pure energy, and then reconstructed into his own prana. But after the first circulation, it was Granny Oyo performing it in his body. She was controlling his cultivation technique, activating it at a higher grade than what he could do at the spirit stage. Prana flowed out of his palms and into the slab of bone, inscribing knowledge into it. Mystic bone art, bone slip. Inala felt knowledge of all the skills he learnt flow through his palms in the form of prana and inscribe themselves into the slab of bone, forming a knowledge imprint. Within a minute, the process was done as Granny Oyo retracted her hand. Inala slumped on the ground in exhaustion, unable to move as he saw the slab of bone fly into Granny Oyo's hand. She grabbed it and absorbed the knowledge in it, muttering, toxin refinement, elixir condensation, and puppetry. You have learned quite a few high-level skills for someone your age. Considering puppetry's unrefined state, it's something you created, right? You have taken inspiration from toxin refinement and elixir condensation, pretty impressive for a brat. She raised a finger, causing Inala's body to follow along in the air, and laid him on the sofa nearby. Granny Oyo tapped him on the forehead and infused a tonic in his body. She released it in vapor form and seeped it into him through the pores on his body. A moment later, Inala got up in a hurry, full of energy. Granny. Inala was depressed. All his skills were stolen, so he would be lying if he wasn't displeased about that. But there was nothing he could do about it. Even 1,000 of him would be unable to take her down. He lost the initiative already. Though, his depressed expression was just an act. He was aware of her nature. Things were still within the plan, just that the level of risk had multiplied. There was nothing else to be done, such was nature. Even though he had a good grasp of Granny Oyo's character, that was only through his perspective as a reader. She was a century-old lady with a wealth of experience under her belt. She might have instinctively sensed something and hence behaved differently. The one before her was a living human and not a character in a book limited to her characteristic traits. Well, worry not. I don't like stealing from a brat, so I'll compensate you fairly. Granny Oyo said as 3 bone spheres flew into her hand. She closed her eyes and focused on them, imbuing something in them through her prana. She then chucked them at him. They are yours. Inala grabbed the first bone sphere and seeped his prana in it, sensing a stream of information flow into his mind, shocked. This is my puppetry skill. I improved it a little. Granny Oyo said calmly. A little is an understatement. Inala was stunned, realizing that Granny Oyo was on another level. She has been alive for more than a century. Of course, the knowledge and experience in her arsenal cannot be compared with a fledgling like me that has only been here for a month. With the upgraded puppetry skill, Inala could do complex plays. It was a proper skill now, unlike the barebone version he had created. Seeing that there were 3 bone spheres, he excitedly grabbed the second one. Spirit reinforcement skill. This was the reason he had approached Granny Oyo. In Sumatra Chronicles, teaching Risha the skill allowed him to successfully reach the peak of the spirit stage and break through to the body stage. It was a necessary skill for someone with fragment disease. And only Granny Oyo possessed this. That was why she was an important character and why every reincarnate intended to trade with her at some point in time after accumulating items that she desired. Spirit reinforcement skill strengthened the spirit containers by breaking and reconstructing them repeatedly. The concept was the same as what Inala did, but the process was many times efficient. He only attempted that training because that was what Risha did in the story. It was all to familiarize himself with the process until he obtained the skill. It was all a matter of when, not why. And now, his theoretical knowledge had once again been transformed into practical knowledge. He intended to use his skills, obtained from Risha, to trade for the spirit refinement skill from Granny Oyo. The order of events went wrong, but he got the intended skill either way. His objective in meeting her was completed. But, there was still one more bone sphere that remained. He wondered about its existence, since in terms of value to someone with the fragment disease, the spirit refinement skill was equal to both the toxin refinement skill and elixir condensation skill combined. And so, it made sense if Granny Oyo had stopped at that. Upgrading his puppetry skill already exceeded the value his side provided in the trade. But, it's before me. So, I must learn it. He couldn't figure out Granny Oyo's thoughts at this part and hence decided to just bite the bullet first and grab the third bone sphere. As the respective knowledge flowed into his mind, Inala shuddered as he stared at Granny Oyo, pale with fright. Chapter 16. Domination and Being Dominated. You are listening at novelfull.audio. BDNVL.M Prana Domination Skill. This was a skill exclusive to Granny Oyo, something she created during decades of research on fragment disease. It allowed her to seep her prana into the target's body and mildly affect them with the fragment disease. By using her prana to heal the damage caused by the fragment disease, she'll leave a mark on the target's bones, thereby turning it into a spirit weapon. Once the process is done, the target would become her living, breathing spirit weapon. Their body would be fully under her control. Risha intended to use the prana domination skill on Inala before to transform him into his spirit weapon. That way, Inala would be forced to reveal all his secrets. Granny Oyo ended up using it on him though. The imprint had been seamlessly integrated into his cultivation technique. This meant that as long as he continues to cultivate, his body will only be further refined as her spirit weapon. Originally during his plans, Inala thought something like that might happen. But, he wasn't affected by such a notion. After all, he had already thought of many ways to use this to his advantage. As a spirit weapon, he could get close to Granny Oyo and gain more resources from her. And there was a greater chance of survival under a master in the life stage. Moreover, the status quo would end during the first major disaster anyway. Granny Oyo loses her life in the disaster, along with most of the masters of their settlement. The imprint would vanish naturally after that, so he wasn't concerned by it. Besides, with her strength, she had no reason to ever use him, for he was just a weakling when compared to her. That was Inala's thoughts until he grabbed the third bone sphere and absorbed its knowledge. The skill he ended up learning was none other than the prana domination skill. He stared at Granny Oyo, terrified, unable to determine what her plan was. Why was he taught this skill? Even Risha only gained it from her moments before her death. That was when intended to pass on her legacy and hence transferred all her skills to him as an inheritance. The prana domination skill was one of them. But why was it given to Inala now? There was no danger to her life now. It made no sense. Look into my eyes. Granny Oyo inched her face close to his, almost touching him. Inala tried to break free but noticed his body was constricted by the formless pressure once again. This time, he wasn't even able to close his eyes, forced to stare into hers. A hypnotic sensation washed over him as he fell into a daze. Granny Oyo whispered in a sultry voice, "Am I pretty?" "Very," Inala replied truthfully, unaware of what he was even talking about. "Tell me what you're hiding." She stared at him, her eyes deathly cold. "Yes." Inala nodded. Bang. Bang. "Did you die, Inala? Are you planning to waste my time? Open up, it's already morning." "Shit." Inala woke up in a hurry as his body was drenched in sweat. He looked around, noticing that he was in his dorm room. What happened? His body ached all over, experiencing piercing pain every time he breathed. Inala didn't even have to guess the cause of the pain. There were cracks throughout his skeletal frame, with fractures in many locations. He was weak all over, unable to get up. Rather, he feared his bones would break if he tried to get up. Bang! The door slammed open as Virala entered the room, accompanied by Rava. His gaze was angry as he stared at the sprawled figure of Inala. "You fucker. Were you planning to sabotage me? I get it, you failed to finish on time, but is that any reason to delay submission until now?" He kicked Inala, flinching to see the latter's leg break into two. "You, what the heck? When did your legs become so brittle?" Virala's gaze covered the empty room and noticed the tub of tonic in one corner. "There it is." Virala opened the tub and noticed a liter of the tonic inside, grinning in excitement. "Petty bastard. You finished it, huh? Anyway, it has already been a few hours since daybreak. You're not getting a paruta more. We're running late, Virala." Rava spoke in a hurry, "The event's starting in an hour. We still need to finish concocting the medicine with this tonic." "Alright, let's go." Virala didn't just plan to sabotage Inala but also intended to use the produced Mud Viper tonic in concocting a medicine that he planned to sell during the event. The false mud doors covered the rest of the room, and hence, Virala couldn't see anything else. As Rava carried the tub and exited the room, he stopped and stared at the mud doors. "He's hiding his plans behind them, right?" Virala placed his hand on the mud doors and pushed them, frowning when they failed to budge. He exerted all his strength and still failed to budge them. In the end, he kicked one of the mud doors in anger. "Why is it so rigid?" "Virala. We're running late." Rava shouted shrilly. "Coming." Virala responded with a shout. He then stared at Inala. "I don't know what you are planning there, but in your current state, you cannot use them. A month's hard work gone down the drain, such a pity." "What just happened?" Inala muttered in confusion once Virala left. The tub of medicine, why was it back in his room? He clearly remembered bringing it to Granny Oyo. It makes no sense. He was confused. The last he remembered was being set on the sofa by Granny Oyo. "Did she do something to me?" "No, she already turned me into her spirit weapon. There's nothing more to do beyond that." He frowned, frustrated. Why was his body in such a state? He couldn't understand. "Damn, my hips hurt the most. Was my jewels crushed or something?" The pain in his groin region was unbearable. It felt like a bull had rammed him there. The day's light wafted into his room through the door left ajar. On the floor he lay, unable to move, failing to comprehend his state. Did my plan go kaput? That didn't seem likely since he still retained the knowledge of the upgraded puppetry skill, spirit reinforcement skill, and even the prana domination skill. The most puzzling of all was his prana. Upon sensing the amount, he was in shock. This feels absurd. How did it rise by so much? Prana, 20. Chapter 17. Storage Lantern. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ugh, shit, fuck. Inala grumbled as he was unable to crawl. Virala's kick shattered his right leg. The pain levels had reached such an intensity that his brain cut off all sensory signals. Now, he lay on the floor numbly. His eyes darted to the door, irritated. That bastard broke the door. It was at this time did he notice the false mud doors that separated his room into two. In the larger section was where everything he was preparing lay. The smaller section was empty and it was only meant to be a space to meet with Greyha and refine Mud Viper tonic for him. He currently lay on the floor in the smaller section. Inala intended to investigate what had happened during the end of his visit to Granny Oyo. But first, he needed to recover from his injuries. I have stored some Mud Viper tonic inside. By consuming it, he would at least be able to focus on recovery. With 20 prana assisting him, he would recover from this damage within a couple of weeks, as long as he doesn't exert himself and further exuberate his condition. Inala seeped his prana into the bone piece embedded in the false mud doors, intending to open them. The doors slid open like usual, causing him to comment in mockery, "Virala, that weak bastard. He didn't even have the strength to open." His words came to a halt as using a bone sphere, he slammed the room's entrance shut. Using the same, he bonked the Mud Viper and made it shoot a mud ball at the entrance, sealing the door. "What is the meaning of this, Oyo?" he muttered, flabbergasted. There ought to have been hardened mud splattered all over the walls in the larger section of the room. It happened while he was practicing his craft and hence became messy. But now, it was sparkling clean. The entire room was barren, save for the bound Mud Viper. Everything he had created and stored in the place no longer existed. The large packages of hardened mud he had accumulated, the various forms of clay he had created, the 400 paruta fruits he had been paid, and most of all, his Inala comedy troupe, all were missing. Just as he despaired, Inala noticed a faint glint from behind the Mud Viper. When coiled on the ground, it occupied a fair amount of space at the corner. In its delirious state, after its weakness had been hit, it thrashed about faintly. Every time it did so, something came into view behind it. No way. He couldn't control his excitement as Inala used a bone sphere to push the Mud Viper away and gaze at the object it had been hiding. Sporting an appearance that of a lantern, with its body built like a 4-story pagoda was the object in question, its entrance being a circular hole wide enough for the human hand to pass through. At the sight of it, Inala muttered in excitement, "A storage lantern." Storage lanterns were the spatial rings of Sumatra. It was an item exclusively refined by the Mammoth clan. And it was by selling storage lanterns that the Mammoth clan was able to trade with the various human kingdoms and empires it passed through. The Mammoth clan was a trading clan at its core, with store lanterns being their core product. The power of a pranic beast was called its primary nature. For the Mud Vipers, their primary nature was mud ball. It was why they shot mud balls at their targets. All their actions revolved around targeting their prey better with the mud balls. Similarly, the Empyrean Tusk's primary nature was internal inertial gravity. Gravitational fields existed throughout its body, with each acting in different areas and at different intensities. It was this that propped up the Empyrean Tusk's otherwise impossible frame. After all, the mass of a moving being more than a kilometer tall was so much that it would collapse on itself. The square-cubed law ensured such a creature couldn't survive. The Empyrean Tusk's primary nature made its existence a reality. It stated that the bones of an Empyrean Tusk are quite fragile. Its gravity acts as a bond and reinforces its strength to the extent necessary to withstand its mountainous weight. And the strongest of this force of gravity exists within its tusks, for they were the Empyrean Tusk's weapons against its foes. When the Empyrean Tusk's tusk grows too much and its tip becomes blunt, the Mammoth clansman would cut off the excess to maintain the sharpness. The cut-off parts of the tusk are then refined using the mystic bone art into the shape of a lantern while amplifying the gravity within. Eventually, the tipping point is reached when gravity becomes strong enough to bend space. As a result, a large space is created within the storage lantern. To insert or take out an item, prana has to be infused into it and deactivate the primary nature active in it. And when done so, the storage lantern grows in size, becoming as big as necessary for the volume of space inside. Items could then be placed inside through the entrance. Once it's activated, the primary nature kicks in as the storage lantern shrinks in size and could be carried on hand. Moreover, thanks to the property of internal inertial gravity in it, no matter how much weight is placed within the storage lantern, the person carrying it wouldn't feel it. Of course, when its primary nature is deactivated and the storage lantern reverts to its original size, all its weight would be felt. So, when one usually activated it, they would set it on the ground. Inala used a spirit weapon to grab the storage lantern and activated it. If its appearance shows 4 floors, it means there are 4 cubic meters of space within it. Thankfully, there's enough height here. Inala sighed in relief as he stared at the ceiling. The floor. Ceiling height here was 6 meters, for they weren't short of vertical space. Using the spirit weapon, he brought it next to him and inched his index finger to touch it. Why is it my spirit weapon already? The spirit lantern had already been refined to carry his imprint. It was his spirit weapon and hence could only be accessed by him. Did she do it on my behalf? Since Granny Oyo controlled his body, she could do something like that. His heart palpitated, for a storage lantern was ridiculously expensive, especially for a 4-story one. 7,600 paruta. That was its current market price and he was given something like that. If I had been given its value in terms of paruta fruits, I would have reached my goal already. He sighed for a moment but became excited immediately after. There should be a reason if he was gifted such an expensive item. With bated breath, Inala infused prana into it and deactivated the storage lantern, watching it grow in size and reach a height of 4 meters. Using a spirit weapon, he opened the first floor, shocked by the contents. Chapter 18. Inudu Plains. You are listening at novelfull.audio. There was a letter inside, the sole item on the first floor of the storage lantern. Inala picked it up and read its contents aloud. Dear Inala, you are now my spirit weapon, and mine alone. But, the current you is too weak. Hence, to make you useful, I have left behind a gift. Work hard in the remaining 11 months. Time is ticking down. Yours charmingly, Oyo. He shuddered at the sentence and sighed in defeat. I messed up. In terms of trade, it was a resounding success. He gained 3 skills that would form the core of his strength in the future. But in terms of stability, he lost sight of the future. Work hard in the remaining 11 months. It meant Granny Oyo was now aware that the 44th Empyrean Tusk would die in that time frame. This was information only the settlement leader, Bora Tusk, ought to know. The fact that Granny Oyo knew it meant she would take steps to ensure her survival. History would change drastically, heck, it already did. After a moment, Inala stabilized his mind. Just the regressor's presence alone will alter the future to an unrecognizable state. But 6 other cooks are steering the pot. Things are bound to get messed up. The moment he had the thought, he no longer cared about Granny Oyo learning the truth. Even she couldn't change anything. After all, if it was ever revealed that she knew the truth of their Empyrean Tusk's life reaching its end, she'll be beheaded swiftly. Therefore, all Granny Oyo could do would be to prioritize her safety and survival. By selling medicine, she had accumulated a lot of wealth. She'll begin liquidizing her assets to raise her strength as much as possible while also gathering as much resources as possible for her future. And the most stable way to hoard wealth was in a storage lantern. The fact that she gave him one expressed her intention clearly. She was giving him the means to prepare for the day when they might have to live without the support of an Empyrean Tusk. Thankfully, I have the prana domination skill. It didn't matter how much Granny Oyo learned from him. She would be the last to do so. Prana domination skill not only allowed him to gain control of the target's prana, it also strengthened his defenses against such attempts. It meant even if Risha were to use the skill on him in the future, it wouldn't work, for he would have the means to defend himself against it. Moreover, if the level of his prana domination skill reaches Granny Oyo's caliber, he could break out of being her spirit weapon. He had the confidence in achieving that. The letter was short, but it lit a fire in him, especially since the wording used was pretty, endearing. Did I somehow open a romance route? I never thought I had it in me. He turned the letter and noticed a couple of lines written there. I have confiscated Inala's comedy troupe. Don't reveal the puppetry skill just to earn some paruta. With the upgraded version and your art skills, it can save your life. She knows about my art skill. Inala muttered as he pondered the statement and focused on the puppetry skill, understanding what she was getting at. Inala opened the second floor of the storage lantern and saw it stuffed to the brim with hardened mud. The third floor contained the various clay and the toxins he had refined for their creation. The items on the second and third floors were what he had accumulated in his room. Now, they were neatly packed in order. It was the fourth floor that held Granny Oyo's gift. Inala opened it and noticed a row of medicine there. There primarily was the Mud Viper tonic, one refined with the skill he revealed to Granny Oyo. There was a liter of it there. Placed next to it in a jar were paruta fruits, 800 in total. The amount he was promised by Virala was already here. It was just that Granny Oyo never revealed the matter to Virala, causing him to think he had pulled one over Inala. Just that allowed Inala to comment smugly, it means in her mind, I'm placed way above you, Virala. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. He was off to a solid start in this race, having already gathered most of the treasures he needed. Now, all that was left was to attend today's event. She already warned me against revealing the puppetry skill. It made sense. The original puppetry skill had no combat value. It was created for entertainment purposes. But after Granny Oyo upgraded it, the skill allowed him to fool others using clones of himself. The clone was just a moving sculpture of himself. But how realistic it could become depended solely on his art skills. And indeed, not revealing it might just end up saving his life in the future. If I can't use it to earn paruta, then there's only one other option. This was originally part of his plan anyway. Now, he just had to proceed with it directly instead of using it alongside the Inala comedy troupe. Based on Rava's shout, there was less than an hour before the event starts. I need to hurry. Inala grabbed the Mud Viper tonic and gulped down large mouthfuls, using elixir condensation and toxin refinement skills in conjunction to raise their effectiveness to the limit. As he activated the mystic bone art, his body temperature rose as the fainter cracks in his bones began to heal up immediately. And once he healed enough, his pain returned, causing him to grit his teeth to avoid roaring. He got up, now having enough strength as he propped his shattered right leg back in its rightful place, watching the healing effect begin rejoining the bones. Virala. His eyes were bloodshot. I'll break your legs too. Instructor Mandu, an elite with barely any presence in the Academy of Refinement despite teaching one of the most important classes, a face every student saw for a few years at the very least. He currently stood at the Academy's training ground, watching the students assemble into a file based on their batches. I'll never get used to the reduced numbers. Following the first minor crisis, their settlement's population shrunk in half. In the academy, 1/3 of the students died to the Mud Vipers. Instructor Mandu stared at the frontmost row which was almost empty, save for a couple of students. The youngest ones were the most targeted by the Mud Vipers. Fucking beasts. I need to relax. Even if he became angry, nothing will change. That one nest had enough capability to swallow their settlement whole, including their Empyrean tusk. If they hadn't managed to break free, everyone might have become a snack. Ha! After exhaling softly, he firmed himself and bellowed upon seeing all the students had gathered, it's a bright day today. The herd has reached the Anuta Plains and has decided to stop for a day. While the Empyrean tusks rest and replenish their resources, there will be a fair. It's time for all 44 settlements to mingle. He shouted and began distributing 10 paruta fruits to each student. You're all students, so nothing much is expected from you lot. Use these funds to buy anything you fancy. And most of all, his voice exuded fighting spirit, boosting the morale of everyone, don't disgrace our settlement's name. In the name of the 44th Empyrean Tusk. In the name of the 44th Empyrean Tusk. All the students shouted, including Inala, who did so from the last row, observing the reincarnates and the regressor standing next to him, prepared. Things are starting to get serious now. It was finally the time to soar while clipping the wings of each other. Chapter 19. Sneak Attack in the Clouds. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Why is this bastard standing like everything is alright? Virala glared to his right in disgust. A moment later, he felt the increased prana levels in Inala, unable to control his grin in response. I see. To heal himself, he consumed all 400 paruta fruits. That explains his increase in prana. He must have expended all other resources in his arsenal to be able to walk again. You're doing well, Inala. What's your secret? Virala asked, putting on a shy demeanor. Inala sported a wide smile towards Virala, you're my secret. Shut up, you two. Standing to the right of Inala was Blola, irritated, I can't concentrate while the two of you bark incessantly. Standing to the extreme right was Risha. He calmly gazed to his left, seeing a silent Yenda standing still like a statue, barely having any presence. The only one hyper among the death row students was Greyha, that was staring at Instructor Mando in excitement. Risha released a tinge of prana, mildly pressuring the reincarnates. The fluctuation was so minimal that none of them felt anything. But, the prana in their bodies reacted as such, releasing a mild fluctuation of their own. That was enough for Risha to sense the amount of prana they had accumulated and confirm his hypothesis, they're my obstacles. Even the weakest, Inala, has accumulated 20 prana. The rest are even faster. His eyes landed on Virala for a moment before he began to walk away. Go to your dorm rooms and put on your best clothes. Return here in 10 minutes. I'll escort everyone to the venue. Instructor Mando said aloud, if anyone wishes to showcase or sell anything by setting up a stall, tell me now. I'll allot you a slot at the venue. We're only informing them 10 minutes in advance. There isn't enough time to prepare anything. Instructor Mando was just about to sigh when 6 people approached him, pleasantly surprising him. What the, is this for real? He stared at the 6 students. All 6 death row students want a stall slot. Yes, everyone nodded in unison. You first need to display your stall's theme to me. Only if you receive your approval will you receive a slot. He trailed off and stared at Inala, giving a slot to him. I'm looking forward to yours. Thank you. Inala didn't say anything about not being able to perform using Inala's comedy troupe like the previous evening. It was Instructor Mando that was there among his 10 audience members. Of course, he was aware of who would lead the students and had the authority to hand out slots. Only after knowing the timing of Instructor Mando's rounds at the training ground did Inala start his play. Inala expected to at least receive some sort of reaction from the rest. But a moment later, Instructor Mando handed a slot to all 6, stunning everyone. So, these bastards already displayed their exhibit to the instructor. The same thought resounded in the minds of all 6. All of them had used some convenient opportunity to showcase their stall's theme to Instructor Mando. Thereby, none of them revealed their cards to each other. This meant they couldn't prepare anything to disrupt the stalls of others in advance. Fine, that's how things are supposed to be. Inala thought as he raced to his dorm, having purchased a large box from the academy. Instructor Mando allowed everyone to take some basic items necessary for setting up a stall from the academy warehouse. With a box of tools in hand, Inala entered his room and began to pack things up. Hardened mud, toxins to soften it, clay, and his sculpting tools in the form of spirit weapons. The box was heavy once he finished packing. Inala stuck flat pieces of bone, spirit weapons, on its underside, using them to alleviate most of the weight. He carefully brought the box down the flight of stairs. Following that, he brought out spirit weapons in the form of wheels, attached them to the bottom of the box, and pushed it forward, joining Instructor Mandu. Those that had to set up stalls would depart a couple of minutes early as compared to the rest of the students. Inala eyed the 5 death row students walking beside him. All were pushing forth a trolley, having covered the contents with a lid. Instructor Mandu led them through the streets of their settlement and arrived before the gates of a blocked region. This was situated atop the Empyrean Tusk's head and was the quarters where the settlement leader and other distinguished cultivators lived. The guards posted at the entrance opened the gates, allowing them to pass through. Their eyes were cold as they gazed at the students, focusing intently on the boxes in their possession. Everyone except Risha shuddered at the pressure emitted by their gazes. The guards were in the life stage, masters of the settlement. They took a roundabout route around the head region, for they didn't have the authority to enter the institutional buildings there. Soon, the group arrived at a pair of massive gates that acted as both the entrance and exit to the settlement. Amazing! Inala muttered at the view. He stood at the edge of the Empyrean Tusk's head, hence able to see everything beyond. It was akin to staring out from a mountain peak. The Empyrean Tusk's nose acted as a bridge and passed through the clouds, going underneath. It felt as if they were celestial beings descending to the earth. Stick close to me. I'm not responsible if you were thrown off. It tends to shake its trunk every now and then. Instructor Mandu warned everyone. Something like that won't happen this time. All the reincarnates thought in unison. Instructor Mandu clicked his tongue when he noticed the lack of fear in the faces of the students. He hoped to scare them at least a little. It was one of the few joys he had. It's ridiculously hard. Inala stared at the floor. The carapace feels like the rocks forming a mountain. They don't seem like a living creature's body. Such was the Empyrean Tusk's grandeur. The exoskeleton covering its trunk was tough enough that with Inala's current capabilities, even if he were to spend a month drilling a hole through it, there would hardly be a dent. The bridge formed by the trunk was very wide, 200 meters at its thickest and around 110 meters at its thinnest, but everyone was careful and moved at the center due to the winds that blew across it. Soon, they passed through the clouds, causing their visibility to drop to 0. At that moment, Inala felt the chills, ducking suddenly as he felt something fly overhead, sensing killing intent all around him. Seriously, the reincarnates intended to throw each other over the edge. The fall would ensure they'll splatter upon impact, a guaranteed death. It was the best way to kill each other, especially when veiled by the clouds. Suddenly, an impact slammed into Inala, knocking out all the air from his lungs. The force of the impact revealed the culprit as he shrilled mentally, Riyesha. Chapter 20. Risha kills Inala. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ugh, Kaga. His arm had fractured under the impact, all the air in his lungs had been knocked out, and a ringing sound resounded in his ears. Death was right at the corner. The trunk of the Empyrean Tusk was a precipitous bridge and the clouds masking everything was the cover of doom that brought about the chaos. It felt like a bone sphere had slammed into him. And judging by the sheer strength of the impact, only Risha was capable of such. This bastard is trying to kill me. He became aware as his already heightened senses further sharpened. Once he was knocked to the ground, Inala understood that getting up would be a death sentence. Risha was out for blood, and so were the reincarnates. This was the best opportunity to dispose of each other. Instructor Mandu had warned them about the risks associated with the descent. When they passed through the layer of clouds, not only would their vision be obstructed, but due to the winds, they wouldn't be able to hear any sounds either. Thankfully, there was one way to navigate forward in such a case. There were creases throughout the Empyrean Tusk's trunk, horizontal in nature. These creases provided them grip during their descent. So, as long as they moved perpendicularly to the creases and proceed through the downward slope, they would be out of the cloud-covered region in no time. The trunk spanned 1.8 kilometers in length. With a brisk walk, that distance could be covered in 20 to 30 minutes. Besides, traversing the trunk while enduring the winds was a test of survival. If you couldn't even angle yourself properly to the trunk and reduce the wind draft, you'll be blown away. You weren't fit to survive in Sumatra. It was that simple. So, even though Instructor Mandu was leading them, he was also testing them. After all, these students were only 11 months from graduation. So, it was time they proved their worthiness to survive. Even if all 6 of them were to perish here, none could hold him accountable, for every single adult in the clan had the same thought process. Moreover, these 6 were death row students. After 11 months, as the instructor that taught them, it was Instructor Mandu's responsibility to personally chuck them into the mouth of a pranic beast, should they not prove their worth. So, whatever happens within the cloud wasn't of his concern. Besides, his ears caught wind of some clashing noise. Once he walked out of the forest region, Instructor Mandu patiently waited. Let's see, how many would walk out of it. How did he survive that? Risha frowned. Once he detected the prana values of the 5 reincarnates, he intended to kill Inala, the weakest first. Besides, since Inala took 2 valuable skills from him, killing him took priority. Once his proficiency with the mystic bone art reaches the required level to learn the bone slip skill, he might sell the 2 skills for a lot of money. That would dwindle my advantage. Hence, he had come prepared, carrying a dozen bone spheres in the trolley he pushed. All 12 of them were his spirit weapons, refined for combat. And the moment they set foot within the cloud-covered region, he sent a bone sphere hurling in Inala's direction, aiming for the latter's chest. One hit at the ribs and they would crack, piercing both the heart and lungs. Inala would be beyond recovery by that point. With that thought in mind, he sent the attack, frowning. There's no shout from him. Did he die or did he survive? Zero visibility and intense winds meant conventional sensory means were blocked, leaving only his senses towards prana. They were like faint clusters he could feel as prickling sensations on his skin. Inala had dropped to the ground and didn't move, but he might be acting. He's one tricky guy. Risha walked towards Inala and slammed a bone sphere in the chest, hearing faint cracking sounds. He wasn't content with it and targeted the head next, stopping only after a few attacks. He crouched low and touched the ground nearby, pausing for a couple dozen seconds. A trail of fluid touched him as he waited. Risha retracted the hand and brought it close to his nose, whiffing the stench of blood. That's his blood, all right. 1 down, 4 more to go. The prana he was sensing from Inala dwindled rapidly, allowing him to judge that the target was indeed dead. A crushed head and a crushed chest, rapid blood loss, and a quickly depleting prana that was leaking out of the body, all were signs of death. But before he could throw Inala's body over the edge, he needed to deal with the rest. They are racing toward the exit. 4 bone spheres hovered around him and began to revolve rapidly. The radius of their revolution gradually expanded as the range of his attack continued to increase. Detecting the closest source of prana, he slammed the bone spheres in them. Bang! A bone sphere slammed into his face, sneaking upon him right as he targeted a figure. When more than one spirit weapon was controlled, the efficiency drops. Risha was using 4 here. To maintain their destructiveness, he only made them spin in a set path. That meant he couldn't focus on other fronts properly. A bone sphere had rolled on the surface and approached him. Risha had indeed detected it since there was a tinge of prana in it. But it had dropped out of Inala's trolley, that's why Risha didn't pay any attention to it. As a result, when it suddenly flew towards him, he was a tad late in reacting. The bone sphere slammed him in the face and cracked his skull. His vision spun from the impact, but he hurriedly gathered his bearings. Risha infused some of his prana into the bone sphere, making it counterattack the refined prana within. Thereby, the bone sphere was neutralized. Prana condensed at his skull as the injury began to heal rapidly. Risha focused on the individual whose prana had spiked at that moment, for that was the one that had attacked him. The one with the highest prana in the group, Virala. Risha glared at the latter that was positioned 30 meters away and retreating. You're my second target.